Oh, I think Mary did it. Thanks,
Oh,
Mary.
thanks, Mary. Okay, thanks everybody for coming tonight. When I was putting this together, I was thinking, well, there's no way I'm going to be able to cover every tree and shrub that exists in New Hampshire in an hour. And if I tried to do that, I'd probably put everybody to sleep. So I'm not going to do that. But I thought what we could do is talk a little bit about some tips for learning the plants, particularly shrubs and trees that are in your backyard. And one of the most important things I think is that for you to realize that you can learn a lot about the natural world by making your own observations. You have observation skills, and if you spend time out in the natural world, there's a lot that you can learn just by opening your eyes, listening, smelling, tasting, doing all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of the approach that I'm going to take. I'm going to give you some ideas for using your observation skills, looking for patterns in the natural world, and really trying to get a sense for what's around you. And also to remember to start with what you already know, that if you're thinking that, well, I want to learn a bunch of new shrubs and trees, that's awesome. But start with what you already know and use the process of elimination to help you figure out the things that you don't know. And I'll use the picture of Chocorua as an example. When you look at this late winter, early spring view of the mountain, you can see patterns on the mountain. Whether you've been on the mountain or not, you can probably make some hypotheses about what's there on the ground, whether it's trees or the rocks underneath. So you look at the top of the mountain, you know, there's no trees up there, so there's a bunch of rocks, more than likely. You can see darker shades on the ridges. You can see this line coming down the middle of darker trees in amongst the gray or brown that's on the mountain. You can notice that there's some darker green along the shore, and if you follow it along to the right, you can see the conifers that are there, the evergreens. So you can start to get a sense for where those different trees are growing, and you can start to think about whether there's south-facing slopes or north-facing slopes, or whether there's a lot of rocks, or maybe one of these ravines has a stream in it running down through. So you can really start to ask questions and explore possibilities as you're looking at what's around you. So think about using the process of elimination, using shape, size, texture, location, where you're seeing it. You look at this black and white photo on the left, you'll notice some darker trees down here that are likely pines. All these other trees are missing their leaves in the fall. You notice at the top of the ridge, there's some really tall trees that are sticking up above. When you add a little bit of color to it, and you start to see that some of these trees still have their leaves late in the fall. The ones on the ridge are kind of reddish brown and matched with gray or the darker greens of the evergreens on the shore. So you can use all of those to help you sort of determine what might be there and start to guess. It's also really good for you to think about how there's a huge variation in nature. So no matter what you learn about trees or shrubs around you, everyone's a little bit different. You can take all these leaves from an oak tree, the same oak tree, and notice that in general, the pattern is similar for those leaves, but the lobes, the points on the lobes are different in each one. There's a difference in size and shape. The grooves in between the lobes are deeper in some places and shallower in other places, all from the same tree. So even one tree can have a lot of variation. So always have that in the back of your mind so that you're thinking about how that might play a role when you're trying to identify something. So we're going to backtrack a little bit, return to middle school or high school biology, and talk about the parts of a tree, because whether you are using your own observation skills or whether you're using a tree guide, it helps to know how trees function. So starting at the roots really ground that plant in the ground. The roots provide nutrients to other parts of the trees. The root hairs and the smaller roots function in that respect. The trunk of the tree is dead wood. The heartwood is in the center. That's living cells that have now died. The growing part of the tree is just under the outside bark in the cambium, which creates new cells to the inside and new cells to the outside. The phloem and the xylem are basically the plumbing for the plant that provides plumbing for getting water up and down the trunk and nutrients and energy from the leaves down to the roots. The branches hold the leaves. The leaves are the energy producing machines of the tree, right? They collect the sun's energy and turn it into food for the tree. So those are all parts of a tree that you can look at when you're identifying things. If you take a closer look at the twigs of a tree, you'll notice that they all have buds. The buds are the nice little packages of next year's either leaves or twigs or flowers, depending on the bud and depending on the plant. The terminal bud is the one at the tip. That's where most of the growth of the tree or shrub happens. In addition to the growth in the width in the trunk of the shrub or the tree. The leaf scars are where last year's leaves have fallen off. And if you look at the leaf scar, they often have a little pattern of bundle scars. Those are basically the tubes that went from the leaves, the living leaves, into the twig. Whether they have needles on their twigs like the conifers do, or whether they have leaves, they all have those similar parts to the twigs. So the next thing you can think about is, are you looking at a tree or a shrub? So how do you tell the difference between that shrub that doesn't grow very tall eventually, or just a young sapling tree? Shrubs in general come up in multiple stems from the ground. They tend to branch pretty low to the ground, very tall. Whereas trees tend to have a single stalk and grow quite tall, and their branches tend to die off pretty low on the stem. So they look tall and straight, essentially. Although in this picture, that black cherry is pretty gnarly looking, and all the little shrubs in the front are sumacs. So you can get a sense for size there, and also know that sometimes black cherries can be gnarly looking, like they're coming out of a horror movie, or they can be tall and straight, depending on where they're growing. But that's a good clue to use before you try to decide what you're looking at belongs to a certain group of trees or shrubs. You have to be a little bit careful with that, because sometimes trees like oak and maple and beech will stump sprout. So if a tree is cut down, the stump will send out multiple stems. And then if a deer or moose comes along and munches on those stems, they'll cause more stems to grow. So it can look shrub-like because it has multiple stems. But if you dig through the leaf litter and down below, you'll find the stump that that they're growing from. So what can you use to identify trees and shrubs? The silhouettes of the trees, the shapes of the trees, the bark on the outside, the buds, the reproductive parts that they have, the catkins or the cones, and then the shape of the twigs or the way they grow. And lastly, where is the tree or shrub growing that you're looking at? You can learn a lot about plant communities just by looking at the ground that you're standing on. You're standing in a ravine where there's a stream. Are you standing on a ridge top where there's a lot of exposed bedrock? Are you standing on an esker, which is the remnants of the glacier from 15,000 years ago? All those are clues that you can use to help you figure out the plant community that you're standing in. So starting with silhouettes, if you look at really tall, very pointy trees, the spruce and the balsam fir are ones that are adapted for our northern winters. So they have a nice pointy top. It helps shed the snow in the wintertime. The white pines have long, flexible branches. They shed a little bit of snow, but you probably know that they also tend to break off pretty easily if there's a heavy, wet snow. Tamarack or larch lose their needles in the wintertime, so they don't have as much surface area to hold snow, so they do pretty well in heavy snow in the winter. But all those silhouettes will give you a sense for what you're looking at. Bark is another good clue that you can use. Is it smooth? Is it papery, or is it flaky? Does it have large plates along the trunk that help you identify it? Is the bark smooth, like this balsam fir on the left? It's smooth and it has these horizontal sap bubbles that if you take your thumb and pop that bubble, you'll get covered with sap. That's a good clue that you can use. And then something smooth like a maple that has vertical cracks in it as it gets older. So different shapes, different sizes, different colors, whether it shreds vertically or horizontally, whether there's deep vertical grooves, those are all good clues that you can use if you can't reach up to look at the needles or the leaves and see the buds that are on the twigs. So if you go to a field guide, you'll notice that that a lot of them have a dichotomous key, and the dichotomous key is basically a yes or no series of questions, or a if it looks like this, go to this page. If it looks like that, go to the next page. So in the case of two of the major groups of trees in our state, the conifers or cone-bearing trees are the ones that have needles. So you might go to the key and it'll say, if it has needles, go to this page. Most of the conifers are evergreen. They retain most of their needles throughout the wintertime, but not all. And then the other choice is whether the trees are deciduous, whether they lose their leaves. They're often called broadleaf plants, or some of the larger trees are called hardwoods. Most of those will lose their leaves. So you have to rely on the buds and the twigs and the fruits or seeds that you might find late in the fall or into the wintertime. But really it's a process of elimination. So even if you're not using a key in a book, you can use your own observations with what you know and eliminate the things you know what you're looking at is not. So let's start with the conifers. It's pretty easy to start with the conifers because the diversity is much less than some of our deciduous and broadleaf trees and shrubs. First way to start is by looking at how the needles are attached to the twig. They can either be attached by bundles, in other words, a bunch of needles that are attached at one place and then attached to the twig, or singly. Or they can have scale-like needles like this Atlantic white cedar. Looks a little bit like snake skin there, and each one of those little scales is a separate leaf. Starting with the pines are attached to their twigs in bundles. White pine's pretty easy one to remember because it has one needle for every letter in its name, W-H-I-T-E. Works for that one, doesn't really work for red pine. Red pine has 2 needles, but has 3 letters in its name. So I guess that doesn't really work too well. But at least it gets you started. So each is a little bit different, 2 to 3 to 5 needles, and some are long and more lacy-like, and other ones are very stiff and much shorter, like a jack pine. So starting with red pine and white pine. Again, if you can reach the needles, you can count the needles and you get a sense for what you're looking at. Oftentimes you can't quite reach those needles, so you have to use other clues. If you look at the picture on the left here, the lower left, those are white pines coming in. They have much lacier, narrower needles, even if you can't count each bundle of needles. And then the red pine over here on the right has much stouter branches, and the needles look stouter. They almost look like little pom-poms at the tops of the trees. And then the bark is quite a bit different too. Red pines have kind of flaky bark, has a bit of a pink or reddish tinge to it, and white pines have a kind of thicker, crustier outside bark as they mature. White pines, when they're younger, have pretty smooth bark. I used to, when I was a kid, I used to like to take the red pine needles. Remember, red pine has two needles, and I'd pull out one needle, and I used to make chains out of the needles. I'd pull a needle out and stick the other end into this little sheath that holds the needles together. And I'd work to see how many feet I could create out of that chain. And I forever remember that red pines have 2 needles simply because of that. Some other pines we have are pitch and jack pines. They have 2 needles in the case of jack pine and 3 needles in the case of pitch pine. You can often tell the pitch pine stands and the jack pine stands by looking around you and seeing where you are. The pitch pines, for example, are a pine of sandy soils, lower elevation. So that's kind of a good clue that you can use even if you can't really see the needles. The bark of both those looks fairly similar, but if you look at the habitat that you're around, you'll see that. Oftentimes, a lot of blueberries, some oaks in the understory. Both of these trees are fire dependent. So in order to regenerate and have their cones open up and deposit seeds, they depend on high heat to get established. So oftentimes these forests that are maintained by land trusts or the state have controlled burns so that they can maintain that habitat. Since most of the time we try to put the fires out. So jumping to the conifers or cone-bearing trees that have needles that are attached singly, you can group those as well. Have sharp pointy needles. I like to think of them as sharp savage spruce because if you reach out and grab a branch to basically to shake its hand, you'll be prickled by those sharp pointy needles. If you do the same thing with a fir, a balsam fir, the needles are flat and rounded and much softer. So you can think of them as flat friendly fir. I don't really have a saying for the hemlock, so you'll have to make up your own for that. But they have flat needles as well, attached singly to the twigs. They are all in different habitats for the most part, but can share the same forest habitat as well, depending on the topography. So here's a good close-up of hemlock and fir. Here's the hemlock. The branches are kind of scattered along the twig. In a fir, it's much more symmetrical. So if you look at the tip of the balsam fir up here, there are 3 little rounded buds at the tips of each of these branches. They're next year's needles. So this was last summer's growth right here, these 3 here from the 3 buds that were there. So that's a really good way to tell fir when you're up close. Again, fir has the smooth bark with the little sap bubbles that are easy to see. And hemlocks have a very rough bark on the outside, sometimes with a reddish tinge. Even when they're quite young, they have a rough bark compared to the smooth bark of balsam fir. So spruces, there's a number of spruces that we have. And red spruce is probably the most common that you'll see around our parts. Again, square triangular needles instead of flat needles. They have fine red fuzz on their twigs, so that's a good identifying characteristic if you get up close. I like to think of these as burnt potato chip bark. Along here, it looks like little pieces of potato chips. Imagine what a tray of potato chips would look like if you put them in your oven and turn them on broil. That's kind of what an adult, mature spruce trunk looks like. And spruce trees, like actually many of the conifers, are shade tolerant, which means that young spruce trees can germinate and grow in the shade of mature spruce or other shade of other trees as well. So in this particular picture, lots of mature spruce in the overstory and young spruce trees growing up underneath. There's a random little hemlock in here in the middle of it, which is also a shade tolerant tree. We have some other spruces too, black spruce and white spruce. Again, this is a little bit like some of our other trees where if you look at the habitat that you're in, you can guess what particular spruce you're looking at. Black spruce are spruce of either higher elevations or low, boggy, wet areas. So if you go to a bog, you're more likely to see a black spruce growing in the middle of it than you are a white pine, say, that doesn't do quite as well in the really wet, nutrient-poor soils. And then white spruce is sort of a mid-elevation and further north species, although sometimes you'll find populations of white spruce along the coast of New England, where the moderating temperatures of the ocean have cooler summers for them to creep down the edge of the coast. And then you go further north, you'll see in the northern boreal forest, you'll see more white spruce up there. So one thing that most of the conifers have in common is that they are trees that grow fairly well in nutrient-poor soils. So if you look at this picture, you look at the trees in the foreground are mostly deciduous trees, mostly hardwoods. There's some birch in there, some red maple that doesn't mind getting its feet wet in this intermittent stream that's flowing down here. And there's some beech in there as well. There's a few random conifers, but most of the conifers, if you look, are growing on top of this huge chunk of bedrock. So if you can imagine being on that chunk of rock, there's probably not much in the way of soil up there. Soil will be pretty shallow, and the conifers do well in those shallow soils because they have very widespread, kind of spread out shallow roots, so they can take advantage of a shallow soil where they don't have to send a deep taproot way down deep into the soil. The conifers, sort of that evergreenness we often think of as being beneficial because it means that they can photosynthesize through the winter. In fact, there's not as much water available in the winter because it's all frozen up in the soil and in the ice. So they are able to photosynthesize earlier in the spring. They get a head start and they can go later in the fall. The fact that they retain their needles is really an adaptation or a strategy for dealing with low nutrients. It's a nutrient conservation strategy, basically. It takes a lot of energy and costs a lot, ecologically speaking, to produce a whole new set of leaves every year. And conifers will hang on to their needles year after year in order to save that energy and nutrient needs for future. Most conifers will lose some of their needles during a year. You know, some of those needles wear out with age, so they drop those and replace them with new photosynthetic energy producing needles. You'll often see in the fall white pines, you'll see the needle drop from white pines, and that's just the normal dropping of usually it's about a third of their needles every year in the fall. So jumping on to the hardwoods, the deciduous trees, one of the first steps to take is to figure out whether the buds and the twigs grow opposite from each other, like in this maple, or the buds are alternate on the twig, on alternate sides of the twig as it moves up the twig. In this case, we have a sugar maple on the left, which is an opposite budding pattern, and on the right is an oak, which is alternate. And also the oaks are well known for the cluster of buds they have at the tips of their twigs. So anytime you find a twig with a cluster of buds, the oak is a possibility of that particular species. Most of the buds have scales that cover the growing leaves or flowers or twigs that are dormant for the winter, and those are protecting the growth or protecting the cells and the material for next spring. You'll notice on this particular twig there are these little white dots along the twig. Those are lenticels. Those are for gas exchange, and sometimes they're more obvious on twigs and trunks of trees than on others. Some scales or some buds have a single scale, like this willow, or in the case of the nannyberry, one that's split up the middle. So it's like two halves of two scales that come together, kind of like a almost like a mollusk, like a clam or a mussel, closing around the leaves that are forming or have formed inside. And then some buds are naked buds, like the hobblebush. Naked buds don't have any scales covering them. They might have a little bit of fuzz like this hobblebush, but otherwise they look pretty much like the leaves are going to become in the spring. So starting with those trees that are opposite, the two that are most common around here that you see on the sides of our scenic roads here in Tamworth are sugar maple and red maple. Sugar maple on the left has pointier buds, has very rough bark, and red maple has smoother bark, although it will shred a little bit more as it matures. And then they have the red twigs and the red terminal bud at the tip with the two side buds or axillary buds on the side. When spring rolls around, they'll have these buds start to get ready to burst for their exposing the flowers and the leaves that will be coming. So a good test for you this winter as you're driving the back roads is to look at the trees along the edge of the road and see if you can figure out whether they're red maples or sugar maples. And then you can test yourself when spring rolls around and the sap buckets go up, and then you'll know which ones are or more likely, you'll know which ones are the sugar maples. So those are good clues that you can use. Another maple that we have that's fairly common in the understory, sort of a mid to understory tree, or I think it's more of a tree than an actual shrub, is the striped maple. The striped maple also has opposite budding patterns and these very distinctive rings around their stems that identify them compared to some of the other maples, and striped bark, just like the name suggests, striped maple. Some people call them moose maple. They have really big, huge maple-like leaves that you'll notice, and moose love to munch on them. Another opposite growing pattern is found in the ashes. We've got a couple different ash species in New Hampshire. I like to try to imagine the faces that are formed in these buds. If you look at this one, here's the leaf scar from, on the right-hand side is the leaf scar from last year's leaf that has dropped off. And the terminal bud tends to be kind of dry, and it's considered a naked bud. And in this one, I kind of imagine a little cartoon bat here with the ears right there and a little smiley face, a little nose in the front. Sometimes to me, it looks like a monkey. You can come up with your own tricks for remembering ash. But these, do have very distinctive bud scars. And those are all good clues that you can use. The bark of the ashes is a little corky, so if you stick your fingernail in it, it's pretty soft. It has diamond-shaped ridges, sometimes straighter ridges, and they can be quite tall. And the canopy, depending on where they're growing, if they're growing in the forest or if they're growing out in the open, can be quite wide as well. So maple and ash are two opposites, and then the dogwoods and some of the viburnums as well have opposite branching patterns. Here's the hobblebush again with its naked buds, and highbush cranberry, the nannyberry, and dogwood. These are all shrubs, so you'll see them growing low to the ground with multiple stems, so that'll be a big clue for you. A good way to remember some of the species that have opposite branching patterns is just remember mad dog, maple, ashwood, dogwood. And that'll get you started at least on grouping some of those opposite patterned shrubs and trees. So jumping to alternate branching patterns, this is a very distinctive one. Very long, pointy, sharp buds with very distinctive scales. If you look closely, you can see the scales on these are quite distinctive. And I like to remember this one by thinking that it would be a son of a beech to sit on them. American beech has very pointy buds. The bark of American beech is very smooth, a little bit like elephant legs, if you want to imagine that to help you out, except for the ones like this one in the back that has gnarly black knobs all over it. That's beech bark disease. It's actually caused by two different organisms. One is a scale insect that breaks through the outer layers of the bark and allows a fungus to get inside. So the fungus is really what's creating that black scarring pattern. But that's a pretty distinctive characteristic. If you can't see the smooth bark and you find a tree in the woods that's all gnarly and black like that with gray in between, it's most likely an American beech. It can have an effect on the tree. If it gets widespread all up and down the trunk, it can make it difficult to transport nutrients and water up and down the trunk. But beech trees can live quite a long time with that, depending on how extensive it is in the trunk. So some other trees that are related to birches are actually the oaks. They also have alternate branching patterns. Again, oaks are main characteristic of oaks. All the oaks are this cluster of buds at the tip of the branch. And very distinctive scales. In this case, the red oak has pointy buds, white oak has rounded buds. Some of the other oaks like scrub oak and bare oak have a little bit different pattern, but again, have multiple buds at the tip of their twig. And then you can use the bark to help you out as well. So here on the left is the white oak bark. It's very kind of shreddy bark and light gray. And then the red oak has these deep fissures or grooves in the trunk with a little bit of red in between. So those are good clues for you as well. And then like the beech, beech and oaks have these dry leaves that tend to hang on late into the fall and also into the winter. Ecologically speaking, the oak and beech families are more of a southern species, and so they retain their leaves a little bit longer than most other trees and shrubs around here. Most of us can recognize the birch trees when we see them, the white birch or paper birch in particular. As they get larger, they have big sheets of birch bark that hang off the trunk. There are other characteristics that you can use in the twigs. The twigs, you'll notice on the bottom picture, they're quite angled, so they're bends to the twigs. They have little tiny white lenticels on their stems. And then they have catkins, which are these little, they look a little bit like cones. They're not really cones, but they are the reproductive parts for that particular group of trees. Gray birches look very similar, but if you look at the difference between that new picture and the white birch, what looks different? What are the patterns that you notice that are just a little bit different? If you look at this gray birch, you'll notice that the branches tend to hang down and they stick on the tree quite a bit longer. Most of this white birch has lost lower branches. This one retains branches and they droop way down. And then if you look at where a branch attaches to the trunk, look at that big V, upside down V. I like to think of it as a black mustache. Those are very distinctive in gray birch. And sometimes the number of catkins can be a good characteristic for the different kinds of birches that you might see. So gray birches tend to have a single catkin. White birch can have a single one, but most often 2 or 3. So that's a good characteristic you can use. And then when they're younger, they have these little white lenticels all up and down their trunks. It makes it a little more challenging. They don't get the white till they're a little bit older. And then another very common birch that you'll see, especially in a more mature forest, are the yellow birches. Nice golden yellow, beautiful, small, curly sections of bark up and down their trunk. and very distinctive scaled buds. They also have a very distinctive smell to their twigs. So if you were to take a twig and scrape a little bit of the bark off with your thumbnail and take a smell, it smells like wintergreen. So it's a good clue for that. But sometimes you can use your nose. In this case, you can taste it. Tastes pretty good too. Tastes like wintergreen. And then you can use the catkins as well. That helps when you have younger trees. But if you're in a more mature forest or an older growth forest, it's a little bit hard to tell when you're looking at a yellow birch. The tree on the left here is a mature, older growth yellow birch. Doesn't have that flaky bark anymore. It's got, looks a little bit more like a maple to me. But if you were to look up into the canopy of that tree, then you would see the golden curls. They're distinctive of the yellow birch. Sometimes you can identify trees and shrubs by, not by their twigs or the way they're growing, but what's growing on them. So in this case, this black knot fungus is particular to black cherry as well as other cherries. So if you're finding a twig with no leaves and you're not really sure what it is and you see that, you can at least decide that it's a cherry, one of the cherries. Cherry twigs are much straighter. The buds look very similar to birch, but the twigs are straighter, whereas in this one, that's a birch twig. So you can see that birch has a little bend to the twig. So that's a good characteristic you can use. The cherries, all the cherries have lenticels, very distinctive horizontal lenticels. Again, those are for the gas exchange that you can see on the trees. As they get older, that turns into more of a burnt potato chip type bark, similar to the red spruce that you might see. And cherries will grow up in places where there's a lot of light. If they're in a big open field, they'll get quite large and have branches that spread in multiple directions. If they're growing up along the shore of a river and there are other trees they're competing with, then they tend to be much taller and straighter than what you'd see in an open field. And all the cherries have a very distinctive odor. Not that nice sweet wintergreen of birch, but if you scrape away a little bark, it has a very strong, pungent odor to it, and you'll know that it's a cherry. So another group of trees that have alternate branches that are quite common around here are the poplars. This one on the left is a quaking aspen. And the distinctive characteristics for that are the reddish brown twigs, new growth twigs. So this is previous year's growth is gray. Last year's twigs are reddish brown. And they have these very distinctive, let's see if I can find a bud, kind of reddish brown shiny buds. They tend to be a little bit sticky. Oops, sorry, back up. And when they're young, they have very light colored trunks, very similar to a birch, like it's in the background here. It doesn't peel. And then at the tip, the tops of the trees, you might see a greenish hint to the bark. That's chlorophyll that's pretty close to the bark. They can photosynthesize through the bark through much of the year. As they get older, it gets a little bit more challenging. Once they're up into the canopy, you can't reach the branches. The bark of this tree on the left is on a big tooth aspen. The one on the right is a red oak, so they look somewhat similar. But if you start looking for patterns again, you'll notice that the ridges on this aspen are much more rounded or square, and the ridges here are flattened, and both have grooves along it. So again, if you start to look for patterns in the bark and you can't quite reach the twigs, you look up into the canopy of the trees, you might see patterns in the branches. The aspen has much stouter branches than the oak does. And again, if you just keep looking and making comparisons, you'll start to notice those differences. Along the shore of the lake, Chocorua Lake, you'll find a number of different shrubs that are around. This one is quite common. Again, shrubs, multiple stems coming up from the ground. This one has lots of catkins hanging down. These are the female catkins, the female flowers for next spring. Here are the buds on the twig, so alternate buds. And then here are last year's catkins. These were the seed producing catkins. So that's a speckled alder, and they do get quite large when the circumstances allow, probably about 4 inches in diameter, 4 to 6 inches. And when they get that big, they tend to start leaning over, and then they fall down and they die, and new sprouts come up from the stump. So a couple more shrubs. This is one of my favorites. This is a beaked hazelnut. You can probably guess where it gets the beaked hazelnut name from, with these little fruits that they have. So that's the casing for the nut that's inside the main body there. They have these little catkins, which will become next year's leaves or flower parts. Little tiny fuzz on their twigs. And they have these beautiful magenta, very delicate looking flowers in the early spring. One of the earliest blooming shrubs that we have around here that you can look for. And it shares the lower canopy, the ground area of the forest with this shrub, which is the witch hazel. Witch hazel is a late blooming, fall blooming lower shrub. It's got naked buds like on this lower picture here, and nuts that form this time of year as well. So right now they're blooming and the nuts have been forming. Sometime this winter they'll explode and send their seeds flying as much as 50 feet away, which is pretty amazing. I've never actually seen that, but I would love to see it. I've only read about it. So witch hazel and beaked hazelnut, 2 alternate branching lower shrubs that you'll find. Here's another example of a shrub or tree that you can identify by something that's growing on it as opposed to its twigs. This is called a pineapple oak willow gall. Sorry, not oak. Pineapple willow gall. It's caused by a midge. The midge lays its eggs on the terminal bud of the twig. The cells of the twig multiply around that and form a little house that midge larva can grow up in. And it's pretty distinctive. If you're wandering around and you're seeing these low shrubs and you're seeing a bunch of these things that look like pineapples, it's going to be a willow, one of the willows. There are many different species of willows, but all of the characteristics of willows are somewhat similar in that they have these buds that have a single scale over them and they hug the twig pretty closely. So now it's time for a little bit of a quiz. So you can kind of use your own observation skills here. I'm not going to test you or anything, but just give you a chance to make your own observations for these next few trees, and then we'll wrap it up. This is this is the tree that's forming. It's just a young tree. It's not very old. You'll notice that the needles are in bundles, right? Instead of attaching singly to the twig, except they're yellow, they're not green. So they're dying back. This tree has already lost its needles. If you look close up, you can see, I'll close in, whoops. Close in on this one a little bit so that you can see the little knobs that are all over these branches. That's where the needles are coming out of. This is one of our only deciduous conifers. This is a tamarack or a larch, or some people call them a hackmatack. Here's another quiz. So if you look at these lacy looking needles on the right, try to remember which one of the pines has really lacy looking long needles. This one is a different one. So this is the red pine with 2 needles coming out of a bundle. And again, if you look at the branches, they look a little bit like pom-poms at the ends of the branches. You can see some cones in there as well. Those darker spots are the cones. And You can think of them as pom-poms, or some people like to think of them as little fireworks that are going off at the tips of the branches. You'll see them out here at the tips of the branches instead of further in on the branches closer to the trunk. Okay, I'm jumping around here, sorry. Okay, there's some trees along a stone wall. Notice the stone wall in the background. It's a little bit hard to tell from the trunk. They kind of look like alternate branches, but it's a little hard to tell. But if you're walking around underneath the tree, you might find one of these. And if you find one of these, then this is a good indication that this is an oak tree. So this is an oak apple gall. And like the willow gall, it's caused by an insect. In this case, they're caused by a wasp. Not a wasp that stings, but a wasp that lays its eggs in the stem of the leaf. The larva gives off chemicals that cause the plant tissue to grow around it, form this little house, basically. The larva lives inside this little tiny ball in the middle of this spider webby looking material, and eats the inside materials, plant materials, and then hatches out and goes off to mate and lay eggs actually in the leaf litter. So it actually has two different generations. But if you find these either attached to the leaves or at the end of the year when it's already emerged out of that little tiny hole right there, you'll know that somewhere near you there's an oak tree. Couple other shrubs. Here's a low growing shrub, doesn't get very tall, usually no taller than your hip. Very pointy needles that grow in little tiny whorls around the outside of the circle. They're very prickly and sharp, so you don't really want to walk through them in shorts, and you don't want to grab onto one. That's the juniper, common juniper, which is a low shrub. And then this one over here, you'll find it around the lakeshore along with the huckleberries and blueberries. This is called maleberry. Again, opposite, or rather alternate buds going up the twig. These are the seed heads from the previous year. Very red, kind of reddish branch tips and buds that go along with that. So it's pretty cool to see those standing out in the spring, or fall rather. So what about this? It's pretty low to the ground. It's got leaves still attached to it. Look at those long, pointy, really sharp buds. This is American beech. Again, looking at the habitat, this is a place where there was a timber harvest and there were a bunch of trees that were cut. So this was cut low and it's stump sprouting basically into multiple stems. If you were to look nearby in the woods, you'd see some mature birch beech around. Again, elephant legs showing up. And there's a nice beech that has growing on the edge of a field with long branches that reach out to the edges. I'm wondering how many of you really check out the wood that's in your wood pile, whether you cut it yourself. You probably, if you do cut it yourself, you probably know what's in your wood pile, but if you have it delivered, a good challenge for a good snowy day is to go out your wood pile and figure out what wood is out there. Most of us can probably tell that the white birch when we see it, or gray birch that's in here. Red oak has this really beautiful, fine, reddish tinge to it, and makes for great splitting if you're splitting kindling nice and straight, if it's dry. There's some red oak bark here with deep grooves or fissures in it. There's the smooth bark of maple. Here's a little bit of ash with the grooves and the diamond shape grooves and kind of corky texture that they have. So lots of different ways that you can tell. So on the last few slides, I just want to remind you and encourage you to pay attention to your surroundings. You can learn a lot about the forest that was there before you arrived and the forest that's going to be there in the future by looking at what's there. So in this picture, there's a little bit of hemlock with its droopy branches. There's a balsam fir with its pointy crown in the background. There's a little white pine down here with its lacy needles. Some big pines in the background with their lacy looking needles. a little red spruce with the tall, straight, kind of upward pointing branches when they're young, and the sharp needles. So lots of different clues that you can see. Standing in a road, looking on opposite sides of the road. This is near my house. On one side, if you look at this forest, it's mostly deciduous trees and hardwoods. A little bit of beech and maple in there, some oak. There's some pine in the background. If I turn and look the other way, this is what I see on the other side. So there's a little bit of birch. There's a couple pines in there. There's some spruce. There's some more pines in the background, but a lot of kind of same age pines mixed in here as well. So what's the difference? Why is it different on opposite sides of the road? So a good clue is the stone wall that runs through there. We all know that stone walls weren't built in the forest. They were built when much of the land in this area was clear for pasture or farmland. Stone walls are boundary markers, or where they were keeping animals in or out. So what was this land used for before? Was that pasture land? There's a power line going through here. So there's all sorts of clues in there to help you out. And I think that's what's really cool about looking at forest communities in terms of trying to figure out what was there before you. Much of what you're seeing in the trees can tell you what was there before you, like this big old wolf pine. Pines don't generally grow in the denser forests unless there's an opening in the canopy where they get sunlight. So this old pine came up at a time when there was lots of sunlight. Lots of branches could extend out to catch the sun's rays. And maybe there was a weevil that killed the terminal bud or branch and caused the main, the side branches to become more of the trunk of the tree. And you can tell a lot about trees and shrubs in the wintertime too, even if you can't really see. If they're covered by ice, you'll notice that this chickadee is sitting in one of the viburnums that has opposite branching patterns. Little cluster of fruit. That's a high bush cranberry that it's sitting in, that you can tell just by the branching pattern that's there. And by looking at the snow, you can tell what trees are under the snow as well. How does the snow affect different trees? The fir and the spruce, the nice tall straight ones, can shed some of that snow. The pines, their branches droop quite a bit in the snow. These poor gray birches are drooping way down to the water. They don't do so well with heavy snow. So take a look at our first snowfall that we get and see if you can identify those trees underneath that snow that's hanging down. And lastly, I just want to leave you with just a reminder again about using your observation skills, looking for patterns, whether you're trying to figure out the trees in your forest or around your yard, up on the mountains. If you're trying to identify clouds, you can look at patterns. Different clouds have different kinds of patterns that show up, and they can tell you a little bit about the weather that's coming or going. So use your forest and your surroundings to help you figure out what's happening around you. And if you're looking for some good reading, there are plenty of good books out there. These are some of my favorites. I use guides and dichotomous keys sometimes, but most of the time I like to look for pictures that match what I've seen. And you can find your own method for finding a good way to identify what's around you. But do get outside and enjoy what's out there. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer questions.
Any questions? I think our challenge is to learn to identify.
I'll ask a question. I sent it in writing, but perhaps you could answer it for me here. Where I used to live in New York, we had pitch pines that were small and grew close to the ground. They gnarled and beautiful. The branches would blanket the ground. Absolutely lovely. Here, the pitch pines are tall and straight. Was I looking at something other than a pitch pine in New York? Is that too general information for you to answer?
No, well, it's a good question. I think it's always a possibility you're looking at something else, but you can look at pitch pines that grow very differently depending on the habitat that they're growing in.
Yeah,
So,
these were rocky. This was rocky soil.
yeah, so there's some places on the coast of Maine where pitch pines grow on the south-facing slopes on a really rocky hilltop, and they are really gnarly. The branches are low to the ground. They're stressed basically. They don't have much soil to grow in. And in that particular place I'm thinking of, there's a lot of wind that comes up off the ocean.
Yeah.
They're dwarfed by the wind, they're pruned by the wind. And then you go down the backside and you find them in a much taller situation. So it really depends on where it's growing. So the amount of water it has, the amount of light, the amount of wind that's affecting it, if it's too dry, if it's too wet. They grow best in the places like the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, where there's broad sandy expanses where they can compete with each other and grow tall and straight.
Right. Right.
That would be my guess. There are also like white pines are often kind of affected by the white pine weevil that affects the terminal or top bud, their growing branch, and when that terminal bud is killed, the lateral branches start competing to take over as the main branch. And I don't know if there are any insects that affect the terminal buds of pitch pines. That's a good question to think about, but that could be a possibility as well.
Right. Yeah. Second question, unless somebody else has one. I don't want to hog the. I don't hear anybody, so I'll go ahead. You talked about certain trees that after they've been cut down, they throw up small branches, and if a moose comes along and eats the branches, then they'll shoot new ones. How do you get rid of those things? I mean, they drive me crazy. I'm trying to get rid of them in my yard.
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Because I have the same problem in my blueberry field. I'm trying to grow blueberries and I cut out the maples and the birches that are coming up, and they new sprouts. So short of taking a shovel and digging out the crown,
right? Yeah.
Of the shrub, or spraying, which I wouldn't want to do or suggest. Right. There are herbicides for stuff like that, but not what I want to do.
Right.
So those are two options, or just keep cutting it back. If you can cut it back multiple times, then they can't get the nutrients back into their roots to send up new shoots. So eventually
right.
they
right. Yeah.
But
keep the chlorophyll away. Just keep cutting them.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. It was a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. There was so much information. I really want to know all of it, but it's.
You can follow your own nose and just pick a few that you want to learn and use your own observation skills, just like you observe the pitch pine and the way it grows. When you like that, ask yourself questions and see if you can figure it out.
Right. Well, I was hoping in 1 hour I could absorb all of your knowledge, but thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Great. Thanks for joining us.
And Bruce, I was going to add that around here over in the Ossipee Pine Barrens and then around Cook's Pond and stuff, even there you see pitch pines growing that look really different. You see a lot of the kind of short stubby ones, and then you get places where they're really tall, and so you can do field trips around here too to see some of that variation.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you both.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Anybody else?
Lots of thank yous in the group chat. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everybody. I'm only 3 minutes late. Okay.